Laura was torn between three men: her husband, his brother, and her yoga instructor. When a DNA test revealed that the father of her child was the instructor and not one of the brothers, chaos erupted. Jake and Ben joined forces to take revenge on Adam, destroying his career. But their final note to Laura was just as cruel. "You poisoned our lives. We are leaving forever." Left alone, Laura realized that her own mistakes had destroyed everything. But is this truly the end, or can she still win back their trust? Jake woke up early, as usual. He worked at a law firm, and the day promised to be as tough as ever. Laura, his wife, stayed home, preparing breakfast as he stepped out of the bathroom. But what he saw when he walked into the kitchen made him freeze. Standing in front of him was Ben, his brother. Jake hadn't expected him to show up. Ben had always been the problematic part of the family. Aggressive, unstable, constantly getting into trouble. The last time they saw each other was at a family gathering several years ago. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, awkwardly eyeing Ben. His tone was tense. "Sorry for the surprise, brother, but I had to run. It's serious. I'm in trouble." "I've got nowhere else to go," Ben replied, nervously glancing at Laura, who stood off to the side. "What's going on?" Jake asked, but immediately realized it wasn't just a casual favor. Ben looked so frightened that he didn't even try to hide his panic. "People are after me, Jake. I messed with the wrong crowd. They'll kill me if I stay in that city." "You're the only one I can turn to," Ben said, looking so exhausted and helpless that Jake felt his breath catch. Laura quietly approached her husband, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We can't just turn him away, Jake. He's your brother. You have to help him." Jake knew they couldn't leave Ben to fend for himself, even if he was a difficult person to have around. But something in Ben's eyes unsettled him. He couldn't pinpoint it, but he felt this wasn't just a random misstep. With those thoughts, he made his decision. "Fine. But Ben, you're only staying for a few days. Start talking. Tell me everything. I respect you, but if you let us down, I don't know if I can help you again." Ben nodded, and Laura, though visibly worried, agreed. She was the kind of person who couldn't abandon family in need, even if it meant having someone under their roof who brought more trouble than relief. That evening, everything changed. Jake couldn't pinpoint what, but there was an unsettling quietness growing between him and Laura. Why had she so readily agreed to take Ben in? What if this wasn't just a story about running away? It was only the beginning. Jake tried to ignore the strange things happening in their home over the following weeks. Ben seemed calm and settled in comfortably, while Laura wasn't the same person she used to be. She began spending more time with Ben, and it started to make Jake suspicious. One evening, Jake came home earlier than usual. He hoped to find some peace, but heard laughter and voices coming from the kitchen as he stepped inside. Laura and Ben were sitting at the table, eating. Ben was joking about something, and Laura laughed in a way she hadn't in a long time. It was unnatural. Jake decided not to intervene but felt his heart tighten. He sat down at the table, and Laura glanced at him. "You're home already?" she asked with a slight laugh, as if nothing unusual was happening. "Yeah, I got off early." Jake tried to stay calm, but his suspicions kept growing. He couldn't help but notice how much Laura had changed. She was more relaxed, laughing more, and there was something different in her gaze. "We're planning a party this Friday," Ben added, seemingly trying to steer attention away from what was happening between him and Laura. "We'll invite some people, play some music, have a few drinks. It'll be fun." "Sounds interesting," Jake said, his suspicions hardening but not wanting to jump to conclusions. Friday came, and as agreed, people gathered at their home. Jake watched how Laura and Ben interacted. They laughed, talked, and seemed increasingly close. It was clearly more than just familial support. They spent a lot of time together, Jake thought, his heart sinking. He couldn't tell if it was just his imagination or something more. Later that night, when most of the guests had left and only a few acquaintances remained in the house, Jake decided to walk around and see what was going on. He stopped by the living room door, hearing quiet laughter. Laura and Ben were sitting on the couch, their heads close together. For a moment, as Jake peeked into the room, they didn't even notice him. Laura licked her lips while Ben whispered something to her. Jake felt his heart race with unexplainable anxiety. Maybe I'm just overthinking, he told himself, but his mind couldn't rest. It was all too strange. After that night, Jake began noticing more odd details. Laura and Ben often went for walks together, and at home, they always seemed inseparable. They even started cooking together, leaving Jake on the sidelines. "Do you want to go out to dinner tonight?" Laura asked one evening as Jake mentioned he was going to take a shower. She was heading for the door but stopped, glancing at him as if testing his reaction. "I don't know. I'm not really in the mood anymore," he replied, feeling his nerves begin to fray. When they went out to dinner again, Jake noticed how often Ben touched Laura, how she laughed at his jokes over and over again. This wasn't just friendly closeness. It was something more. Jake began to realize that maybe he wasn't imagining things. But there wasn't enough proof. He couldn't be sure. Laura continued to behave with him as she always had, hugging him, kissing him goodbye, but something was off. She no longer sat beside him on the couch every evening when he came home. She wasn't as close as before. Something had changed, and he couldn't figure out what it was. Meanwhile, Ben continued to stay in their home. Laura assured Jake that her brother simply couldn't leave his past behind and needed time to deal with everything that had happened in his life. But Jake couldn't forget the evening he saw them in the living room. He was convinced something was going on. However, despite all his suspicions, he couldn't find any clear evidence of betrayal. Meanwhile, Laura and Ben continued their quiet and increasingly dangerous flirtation, and Jake felt the pressure building in his chest. He decided to take the final step and find out the truth at any cost. Ben and Laura began spending more and more time together, but their behavior became increasingly mysterious to Jake. At first, he just couldn't understand what was happening, but he increasingly felt that there was more between them than just friendship. They hosted parties, invited guests, and often stayed together even after everyone else had left. One evening, after another party, Jake stayed in the kitchen while Ben and Laura went into the living room. He noticed how they laughed and quietly looked at some photos on their phones. Jake felt a growing sense of unease, as if he were missing something important. "Maybe I'm just overreacting?" Jake thought. He tried to distract himself, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave him. "Everything okay, Ben? You've been acting a bit strange lately," Jake finally decided to say. Ben paused for a moment, but then smiled and replied, "Everything's fine, brother. Sometimes you just need a break from all the hustle and bustle." But Jake remained unconvinced. His intuition hadn't failed him before, and he decided to keep a closer eye on things. Laura also began acting a bit strangely. She spent more time with Ben, and though they had always been friends, her behavior had become more open and carefree. She laughed at his jokes and sometimes looked him in the eyes with the same gaze Jake had only seen when he and Laura had shared a special connection. Jake couldn't understand what he was feeling. There was a time when he doubted whether he was interpreting the situation correctly. But when he once walked into the room and saw Laura and Ben seemingly caught in a moment of silence that was on the verge of something more, he realized he couldn't ignore it. "What's going on with you two?" he asked directly. Laura immediately pulled back, but Ben just smiled, as if nothing had happened. "You're just worrying about nothing, Jake. We're just spending time together. What's the big deal?" Ben replied. But Jake couldn't let go of his suspicions. He felt that something was wrong. His brother, once so open and honest, now seemed cautious and manipulative. And though Jake tried to push it to the back of his mind, he realized he couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. He decided to stay alert and let the truth reveal itself. The next day, Jake decided to talk to Laura to find out if there was anything more between her and Ben. But she remained as enigmatic as ever. "Laura, I just want to understand. Is there something going on between you and Ben that I should know about?" Jake asked. Laura looked at him for a few seconds, then replied, "There's nothing, Jake. You know Ben and I are just trying to work together and keep the atmosphere in the house calm. It's just friendship." But Jake wasn't sure. His intuition told him otherwise, and even after that conversation, he felt there might be more than just friendship between Ben and Laura. He didn't know how to prove it, but now he was determined to find the truth. And though Jake tried not to stir the situation further, he couldn't leave it unresolved. The tension between the three of them grew, and every day brought new questions. Laura had recently taken up yoga, which had become a revelation for her. The sessions not only helped her improve her physical fitness, but also gave her an opportunity for deeper self-discovery. She began frequently inviting her trainer, Adam, to their home for private sessions. Jake noticed how Laura and Adam were spending more and more time together. At first, he took it calmly, but with each session, his feelings of jealousy grew stronger. What puzzled him was how, with every session, Laura seemed more relaxed, as if there was a certain special energy between her and Adam. One evening, when Jake came home early, he noticed Laura and Adam sitting together on the couch, discussing new exercises for their next session. The atmosphere in the room was light, but Jake couldn't help but notice how attentively they listened to each other and laughed. "I see you're having a good time," Jake said irritably as he walked into the room. Laura immediately looked up and Adam, seemingly oblivious to the tension, replied, "Hello, Jake. We were just discussing some new yoga poses that might be helpful for you. It's for your back." "My back?" Jake asked with a hint of sarcasm, looking at them. "Well, I didn't know yoga had such serious discussions." Laura placed her hand on his, trying to calm him down. "Jake, there's no need to get upset. Adam is genuinely helping me, and I can see the benefits." Jake kept his composure, though his internal tension was building. It seemed that every interaction between Laura and Adam was another crack in their relationship. He decided he needed to find out more about what was going on between them. In the following days, Jake noticed how often Laura and Adam met and spent time together, even when he was busy at work. They went to the park together, discussed yoga, and then, seemingly by coincidence, met up for coffee. At some point, Jake couldn't take it anymore and decided to approach Ben. He didn't want to talk about his jealousy outright, but the need for support was obvious. "Ben, have you noticed how much time Laura spends with Adam?" Jake asked, sitting on the couch. Ben, as calm as ever, replied, "Well, they do yoga together. That's normal. Adam is a good trainer, and Laura is just looking for ways to improve her well-being." Jake felt that this wasn't just a fitness hobby. A suspicion was growing in his heart, but Ben merely brushed off his concerns. "Don't you notice how Laura has changed? She's more open now, laughs more, and we haven't communicated like that in ages. And this Adam, isn't he getting a little too close to her?" Jake said, trying not to sound too obvious. Ben paused for a moment before replying in a voice that sounded slightly suspicious to Jake. "Well, I think you're overreacting. Laura, yoga, that's her choice. Adam doesn't play the role you're imagining." Jake wasn't convinced Ben was being truthful, but his feelings wouldn't leave him alone. And even though Ben denied all suspicions, Jake felt something wasn't right. Laura, for her part, began noticing the tension in Jake. She asked him why he often looked at her and Adam with suspicion, but he only replied briefly, "It's nothing. I just think you're spending too much time with him." In the evenings, after yoga sessions, Laura often invited Adam to their home, and Jake could no longer ignore what was happening. However, during these moments, he became more withdrawn, trying to figure out both himself and what was really going on between Laura and her trainer. Jealousy began to cloud his judgment, and Jake increasingly found himself observing them. Laura, realizing that her husband was starting to feel the strain, decided to take measures to avoid creating even more tension in their home. But her trips to Adam, even during the most innocent moments, were becoming increasingly confusing and difficult for Jake to handle. The next day, Jake came home and saw Adam talking to Laura, and she was laughing, looking at him with a serious expression. What's going on between them? Jake once again heard the question in his head, without having an answer. Laura stood by the window, pensively looking out at the quiet neighborhood beyond their home. She felt her heart beating faster as her thoughts returned to everything that had happened over the past few weeks. Jake and Ben were upset with her, and it was taking a toll, but she knew their objections wouldn't last. She would decide for herself what to do. There was a knock on the door. Laura turned around. It was Ben. His gaze was serious, but there was a glimmer of fatigue in his eyes. "I know you want to keep doing yoga with him," he said as he entered the room, "but this can't go on like this." Laura stared into his face, her heart pounding in her chest. She was surprised, but not scared. She had already sensed that the situation was reaching a boiling point, and now she was ready to act. "It's my choice, Ben, and I won't let anyone else decide for me," she replied calmly, though inside she was seething. I'm going to keep doing yoga. The trainer hasn't done anything wrong, and it's your problem if you think otherwise. You don't even realize how complicated you're making things, he shot back, his voice growing sharper. We can both see how much time you're spending with him. This isn't just about the sessions, Laura. Laura took a deep breath and stepped closer to Ben, her face becoming serious. I don't want you to control my life, and you have no right to tell me who I can talk to. I'm not betraying you, Ben. It's you who doesn't understand what I truly want. He stayed silent, looking at her. Laura felt his irritation rising, but she wasn't going to back down. If you want me to stop the sessions, you need to have a serious talk with Jake. I've already explained that I can't give this up, she added. But I'm not betraying you or him. I just need to find my own path. Ben stared at her, his face becoming even more pensive. He didn't know how to respond. He had been trying to control the situation, but he realized that it might not end the way he had planned. You really don't understand, he whispered, turning to leave. He didn't say anything else. Laura was left alone, but her heart raced as she realized she wouldn't be the same anymore. She had decided she would do whatever it took to find her place in the world. But both Ben and Jake began to understand that things weren't as simple as they thought. They both had their own views on how things should be, and that only added to the tension. And although Laura tried to maintain her independence, she knew that every step she took was becoming more significant. Jake started noticing little things that wouldn't let him rest. One day, when he came home early from work, he saw Laura and Ben looking through old photo albums together. Their laughter echoed through the living room, and they didn't even notice his arrival. Jake felt a dull resentment growing in his chest, but he said nothing. "Nice day," he remarked curtly as he walked past them. Laura, as if nothing had happened, replied, "Yes, we were reminiscing about the old days." Ben just smiled. Jake watched him closely. His brother, always cocky and confident, seemed far too relaxed, as if he knew he had the upper hand. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept circling around Ben and Laura. What was going on between them? Was it just his imagination? Or was it the thing he feared most? The next day, he decided to come home from work even earlier without telling Laura. The house was quiet, but he noticed that Laura was dressed much better than usual. There was a sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. "What have you been up to all day?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Just running errands," she replied, avoiding his gaze. Her answer didn't reassure him. Jake began carefully checking her phone, looking for evidence. But he found nothing concrete, just a few messages from Ben that seemed too innocent. That evening, he tried to talk to Laura, but she was cold and reserved. "Why have you been so distant lately?" he asked. "It's you who's been distant, Jake. You come home tired and only ever think about work," she replied, almost reproachfully. Her words stayed in his head. Jake decided to be more attentive to her. He started staying home more often, but it only made things worse. Laura grew increasingly restless, and Ben seemed to revel in having sown doubt in his brother. One evening, when Jake went to bed early, he heard Laura go downstairs. Curious, he decided to follow her quietly. Muffled voices came from the kitchen. He crept closer and heard her whispering, "We can't keep this up for much longer. He's already suspicious." Ben's reply was quiet, but Jake caught it. "It'll be fine, Laura. Just give me time." That was enough for Jake's suspicions to solidify. He decided not to confront them immediately but made a simple plan. He would catch them red-handed. A few days later, he pretended to leave for a business trip. After saying goodbye to Laura and Ben, he left the house, only to return an hour later to see what was happening. When Jake entered the house, he heard laughter coming from the living room. As he got closer, he saw Laura and Ben sitting on the couch, far too close to each other. Their hands were touching. This was more than just friendliness. Unable to hold back, Jake stormed into the room. "What's going on here?" he shouted. Laura and Ben jumped apart. Her eyes showed more fear than guilt. "Jake, it's not what you think," she began, but her voice trembled. "Oh no, Laura, it's exactly what I think. And you're not even trying to hide it." Ben, as cocky as ever, stood up and looked at his brother. "Calm down, Jake. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Jake nearly lost control. I'm not blind, Ben. Laura stood between them, looking confused. I didn't want it to happen this way, she whispered. Those words were the last straw for Jake. He turned and left the house, leaving them alone. All he could think about was how they could have done this to him. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter for him. He decided he would no longer let himself be deceived. But Laura and Ben had no idea what consequences awaited them. Jake returned home 3 days after leaving, without leaving a single message. He looked calm, but his eyes burned with anger. Laura met him in the living room, smiling nervously, as if nothing had happened. "You decided to come back?" she asked, trying to hide her anxiety. "You could say that," Jake replied curtly, glancing at the couch where Ben was sitting. "I see you've kept yourself busy." Ben simply shrugged. His confidence irritated Jake. He stepped closer and, leaning toward his brother, said, "We need to talk. Alone." Laura stepped forward, but Jake raised a hand to stop her. "Leave us." She hesitated, but eventually left the room under the weight of his tone. "What do you want to say, Jake?" Ben asked, settling comfortably on the couch. "I want the truth," Jake began, sitting across from him. "How long has this been going on?" "What exactly?" Ben replied evasively, smiling. "Don't play games with me, Ben," Jake snapped. "I know what you and Laura have been doing behind my back. And what are you going to do about it?" Ben asked calmly, showing no fear. Jake smiled, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll find out. But first, I want to hear you admit it yourself." "Fine," Ben said, leaning forward. "Yes, there's something between Laura and me. But it happened not because I wanted it, but because you lost your connection with her. Are you seriously trying to justify yourself?" Jake stood up, his fists clenched. "It's none of your business what happens in my marriage." "It is now," Ben shot back. "And Laura made her choice." "Choice," Jake repeated, smiling with a mix of sarcasm and anger. "Then let's see how she feels about your next choice." Without elaborating, he left the room. The next day, Laura noticed that Jake was acting unusually calm. He made her coffee and suggested they go out for dinner. "What's changed?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "I just decided to give us a chance," he replied with a warm smile. She accepted his offer, but unease lingered. At the restaurant, Jake seemed cheerful, but there was something off about his conversation. He kept hinting at surprises and trials that lay ahead. That night, when they returned home, Laura received a message from Ben. "Be careful. Something's wrong with Jake." Her heart started pounding faster. The next morning, Ben was gone. Laura searched for him, called him, but his phone was off. She turned to Jake. "Have you seen Ben?" "No." "Why? Has he gone somewhere?" he asked, seemingly innocently. Fear flickered in her eyes. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. A stranger handed Laura a small package with a note. "Don't think this will go unpunished. You and Ben deserve the consequences. Next time, think through your choices." Inside the package was Ben's torn shirt, stained with what appeared to be blood. Laura, panicked, called the police, but they couldn't do anything without additional evidence. Jake sat calmly in the living room, reading a newspaper. "Do you know anything, Jake?" she asked, barely holding back tears. "Maybe," he replied without looking up. "You said it was your choice. Now live with it." Laura realized this was only the beginning of what Jake had planned. Laura sat in the kitchen, clutching her phone. She had tried calling Ben dozens of times, but all her attempts were in vain. The situation filled her with panic, and her thoughts spun around one question. What did Jake do? Jake walked into the kitchen, looking calm. His cold gaze rested on Laura. "Why so tense?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Where's Ben?" Her voice trembled. Jake looked up, smirking slightly. "And why does that concern you so much?" "Don't play games with me, Jake. Did you do something to him?" "And if I did?" His tone remained unnervingly calm. He probably realized he wasn't needed here anymore. Laura felt fear creeping over her. She stood up and moved closer to him. "If you did something to him, You what, Laura?" Jake stepped forward, nearly touching her. "Call the police? Tell them your husband found out about your little betrayal and decided to act?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. You would never do that. That's not who you are. Jake laughed sharply, almost maniacally. Oh, Laura, you have no idea what I'm capable of. He left the kitchen, leaving her standing there, clutching her trembling hands. The next day, Laura decided to contact Ben's friends. She called every one of them, but no one knew where he was. Jake watched her actions without interfering, but his gaze held a sinister satisfaction. That evening, as they sat at dinner, Laura couldn't hold back. You can't just stay silent, Jake. If you did something, tell me. You want the truth? He put down his fork, looking at her intently. Fine. Ben is safe. Safe, she repeated. What does that mean? I made sure he wouldn't come between us again, Laura. You just sent him away? She asked, struggling to believe it. No, that would have been too easy. I made it clear that if he showed up in our lives again, it would be the end for him. Laura felt a mix of fear, relief, and anger. You had no right to do that. And you had no right to betray me, he said, standing up, his voice growing colder. You don't even realize how far I'm willing to go to protect what's mine. A week passed. Laura tried to return to normal life, but the feeling of dread never left her. One day, she received a message from an unknown number. Laura, I'm coming back. We need to talk. Ben. Her heart raced. She quickly deleted the message, fearing that Jake might see it. That same night, she woke to the sound of movement outside. Looking out the window, she saw a figure quickly disappearing behind some cars. Her heart pounded harder. The next morning, she decided to confront Jake. We need to stop this, Jake. You can't keep me living in this constant fear. And you think I should just forget how you and Ben betrayed me? We made a mistake, she whispered. But we can try to start over. Start over? His laughter was bitter. You, Laura, already destroyed everything there was to destroy. A few days later, Jake left early in the morning for business. Laura decided to take the opportunity to meet Ben. She responded to his message and arranged to meet him at a cafe outside the city. Ben looked tired but still confident. What did Jake do to you? She asked, sitting across from him. He scared me, Ben admitted. But I'm not backing down, Laura. We deserve a chance. A chance? She looked at him in surprise. You really think that's possible? We can start fresh. Together, he said, taking her hand. Laura felt a whirlwind of emotions. She knew Jake wouldn't let them be together, but her feelings for Ben were strong. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was Jake. Where are you? His voice was cold. At the store, she replied, trying to sound calm. Come home. We need to talk. When Laura returned, Jake was already waiting for her in the living room. He held her phone in his hand. You thought I wouldn't find out? He asked, showing her the message from Ben. She froze, her heart racing. It's not what you think. Not what I think, he raised his voice. You met him again, after everything that happened? I wanted to end it, she tried to justify herself. Jake threw the phone onto the table and stepped closer to her. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Laura saw something new in his eyes, not just anger but real danger. Ben unexpectedly appeared outside the house that night. Laura was sitting in the living room when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it, and her heart stopped when she saw him. He looked exhausted but determined. Are you insane? What are you doing here? She whispered, glancing around to make sure Jake wouldn't see. I came to end this, Ben said, locking eyes with her. We won't hide anymore. He'll kill us both if he finds out you're here. She nervously clasped her hands. He'll find out, Ben replied calmly. That's exactly what I want. What? She gasped. We're going to talk it out, Jake and I. We'll settle this once and for all, Ben explained, stepping inside to prevent Laura from closing the door on him. She didn't have time to protest before she heard Jake's footsteps approaching. He stopped when he saw Ben, his face freezing with rage. You have the nerve to show up here? Jake said quietly but threateningly, clenching his fists. We need to talk, Jake, Ben replied confidently. No drama, just an honest conversation. An honest conversation? Jake stepped closer, his voice rising. After what you did? I did what anyone who's fallen in love would do, Ben snapped. not looking away. And you're not innocent either. We both lost control. I'm not going to let you take Laura, Jake said coldly. Laura tried to intervene. Have you both lost your minds? This isn't a competition. Quiet. Jake raised his hand to stop her. We'll settle this like adults, Ben said. You can't force her to stay with you if she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to be with you either, Jake retorted. You're both wrong, Laura suddenly shouted, her voice trembling. You think this is just about the two of you? The men looked at her in surprise. What are you talking about? Jake asked. Laura lowered her head for a moment before looking up resolutely. There's another man. What? Jake and Ben said in unison. His name is Adam, she admitted. Jake stepped back as if he'd been punched in the chest. The yoga instructor? Yes, Laura said, searching for the right words. It just happened. We spent time together and you betrayed both of us, Ben said quietly, his voice trembling with anger. Jake laughed. A bitter, almost insane laugh filled the room. You're telling me we almost killed each other over you, and meanwhile, you were having an affair with someone else? I didn't think it would go this far, Laura tried to explain. I didn't know what to do. Of course you didn't, Ben said coldly. You like playing games. You just used us. That's not true, she cried. I really loved you both. Loved? Jake interrupted her. That's not love, Laura. That's manipulation. What are you going to do now, brother? Ben asked Jake. Is there any point in fighting over her? There's no point, Jake replied after a long pause. She betrayed us both. Laura tried to move closer to him, but he stepped back. You made your choice, Laura. Now live with it. Ben silently walked toward the door. We both deserve better than this, he said before leaving. Jake remained standing, staring at Laura. You destroyed everything we had. He left, leaving her alone. She realized she had lost everything. Love, trust, and any hope for forgiveness. Laura spent several sleepless nights reflecting on the situation. She knew that what she was about to do might seem insane, but she saw no other way out. When the time came, she invited Jake and Ben over to her house, insisting that it was important for all of them. Ben arrived first, looking tense. He entered the living room, where Jake was already seated. The tension between the brothers was palpable. Laura, what's going on here? Jake asked, breaking the silence. Make it quick. I'm not planning to sit here all day, Ben added. Laura took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She sat in a chair opposite the men, gathering her thoughts. I have something to tell you, she began, her voice weak but resolute. Just say it, Jake snapped impatiently. I'm pregnant. The room fell into absolute silence. Both men's eyes widened as they looked at Laura, as if she had just said something impossible. What? Ben finally exhaled. Are you serious? Jake added, his voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. Laura nodded, feeling her breath catch from the tension. Yes, it's true. And now what? Ben leaned back, seemingly trying to process the news. You both need to know that I don't know whose baby it is, she admitted, looking at them. Is this a joke? Jake leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. How could you let this happen? It happened the way it happened, Laura replied, nervously clasping her hands. But I can't change it now. You think we're just going to sit here and wait to find out who the father is? Ben stood up, pacing nervously around the room. I think we need to find a solution, Laura said firmly. A solution? Jake repeated sarcastically. And what solution would that be, Laura? We could live together, she quietly suggested. Ben abruptly stopped and turned to her. Together? Are you serious? I don't see another way, Laura continued. We all have a responsibility for this. This is absurd, Jake said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Think about it, Laura looked at both of them. I don't want our child's life ruined because of our mistakes. You want all three of us to live under one roof? Ben asked incredulously. Yes, Laura replied. It will be difficult, but it's the best way to give the child a normal life. The men exchanged glances. In their eyes, there was a mix of anger, doubt, and a growing realization that this might be the only option. This is the craziest thing I've ever heard, Jake finally said, shaking his head. But you're not saying no, Laura noted. Ben sighed, running his hands through his hair. We don't even know whose baby it is. How is this supposed to work? We'll figure that out later, Laura said, trying to sound confident. Jake clenched his fists, but suddenly stood up. Fine, I agree, but only for the sake of the child. Ben looked at his brother, seemingly weighing his words. After a long pause, he nodded. All right, but don't think I'm doing this for you, Laura. I'm doing this for the chance to be a father. Laura exhaled with relief, although she knew this was just the beginning. A tough battle lay ahead to maintain any semblance of normalcy in this chaos. Months after they started living together, the tension in the house only grew. Laura tried to keep the situation under control, but the atmosphere between the brothers was explosive. Every conversation ended with hints, mistrust, and veiled accusations. One morning, when Laura was home alone, she received a letter from the clinic where she had undergone a DNA test to determine paternity. Her heart raced as she opened the envelope. The result was unexpected. The child's father was Adam. Laura sat in the kitchen, holding the results in her hands. She realized there was no point in hiding the truth anymore. That evening, she gathered the brothers in the living room. We need to talk, she began. Again? Jake asked skeptically. This is serious, Laura added, avoiding their gazes. Ben crossed his arms over his chest. Well, speak up. I took a DNA test, she said, clutching the paper in her hands. And? Jake leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The father of the baby is Adam, she admitted, her voice trembling. The room fell into deep silence. Jake and Ben stared at her, their faces frozen in shock. Adam? Ben repeated, barely believing his ears. That yoga clown? You're joking? Jake rose from the couch, his voice low but filled with fury. I didn't want it to happen this way, Laura tried to explain. You didn't want it? Ben repeated sarcastically, raising his voice. You lied to us, made us live in this farce, and now you admit the baby isn't even ours? I didn't know how to tell you, she whispered. It doesn't even matter anymore, Jake said, looking at his brother. We wasted time and energy on this lie. So now what? Ben asked, glancing at Jake. Now we end this once and for all, Jake replied, his voice cold as ice. The next day, the brothers disappeared from the house without saying a word to Laura. They had found Adam's address and went to confront him. Adam opened the door to his apartment and saw two furious men standing before him. What do you want? He asked, visibly tense. We want to talk, Jake said, stepping forward. About Laura, Ben added with a sinister smile. I don't know what you're talking about, Adam tried to defend himself. Oh, you know exactly what we're talking about, Jake said, forcefully pushing him back into the apartment. The brothers didn't intend to let this slide. Not only did they make Adam feel the consequences of his actions, but they also ensured his reputation was destroyed. They spread rumors at his yoga studio about his unprofessional relationships with clients, and within days, Adam lost his job. After dealing with Adam, the brothers returned home to settle one last matter. They packed their belongings and left a note for Laura. You poisoned our lives. We will no longer be part of your chaos. Forget us. We've already forgotten you. When Laura found the note, she felt her world shatter completely. Jake and Ben disappeared from her life as abruptly as they had appeared. She was left alone, without support, with a baby in her arms and a heavy sense of guilt for all her mistakes. The brothers, finally free from this toxic triangle, began new lives, leaving the past behind. Do you think the brothers made the right decision to completely disappear from Laura's life after her betrayal, or should they have stayed for the child, even if Adam turned out to be the father?